Door, the silence. Most people are running from. There is something deeply disturbing about silence that most people never talk about. The moment the noise disappears, the moment the distractions stop, the moment a person is left alone with nothing except their own thoughts, something uncomfortable begins to happen inside the mind. Anxiety slowly rises. Restlessness appears. An invisible tension takes over the body. Suddenly, the person feels the urgent need to reach for something. A phone, a conversation, music, television, social media. Anything capable of preventing the encounter with themselves. And maybe this reveals one of the greatest psychological weaknesses of modern humanity. Most people are not truly afraid of being alone. They are afraid of facing what exists inside them when there is nowhere left to escape. The modern world has created millions of people who are constantly surrounded by stimulation, but completely disconnected from their own internal reality. They wake up consuming noise and fall asleep drowning in distraction because silence has become unbearable for the average mind. Carl Jung understood this long before the digital age existed. He believed that every human being carries an unconscious world hidden beneath the surface of daily life. A place filled with fears, unresolved pain, hidden desires, insecurities, suppressed emotions, and truths people spend years trying not to confront. The problem is that solitude has a terrifying power. Solitude removes the masks. It strips away performance. It destroys distractions. And when all external noise disappears, a person is finally forced to encounter the version of themselves they have been avoiding for years. This is why so many people panic in silence. Some people cannot eat alone without feeling uncomfortable. Others cannot spend a single evening disconnected from social validation. Many are incapable of sitting quietly with their own minds for even a few minutes before feeling emotionally overwhelmed. They do not realize that this constant need for stimulation is not normal peace. It is psychological escape, a silent addiction to distraction. The modern world encourages this behavior because distracted people are easier to influence. A person who never spends time alone rarely questions who they truly are. They absorb opinions without reflection. They follow crowds without awareness. They seek approval without understanding why. They become emotionally dependent on noise because they never develop the strength to stand calmly inside their own mind. And this is where intelligent people begin to separate themselves from the majority. Highly intelligent individuals eventually discover something powerful about solitude that most people never experience. They realize that silence is not empty. Silence is revealing. In solitude, the mind begins to reorganize itself. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions become easier to understand. Priorities change. The constant pressure to perform for others slowly disappears. What once felt uncomfortable starts becoming liberating. This is why many intelligent people naturally distance themselves from excessive noise, superficial conversations, chaotic environments, and endless social stimulation. Not because they hate human connection, but because they understand the psychological cost of never being alone. A mind constantly consumed by external noise eventually loses contact with its own identity. Jung explained something extremely important about human behavior in his work. 2 essays on analytical psychology, he suggested that until a person becomes conscious of what exists inside them, the unconscious mind will continue directing their life from the shadows. In simple words, the fears you avoid, the emotions you suppress, and the truths you refuse to face in silence eventually control your decisions without your awareness. That is why solitude becomes terrifying for many people. Because in silence, excuses disappear. Distractions lose power. The performance ends. And for the first time, a person begins hearing thoughts they spent years trying to silence. But intelligent people slowly learn to stop running from this experience. Instead of escaping themselves, they begin observing themselves. Instead of fearing silence, they start using it as a tool for clarity. Instead of depending on constant validation, they develop internal stability. What begins as loneliness eventually transforms into self-knowledge, emotional discipline, and psychological independence. And maybe this is the hidden truth almost nobody wants to accept. The people who cannot stay alone are often the people least connected to themselves. Meanwhile, those who learn to embrace solitude quietly develop a level of mental strength, self-control, and emotional freedom that becomes impossible to fake. But to truly understand why solitude becomes a super ability for intelligent minds, you first need to understand why the majority of people are psychologically incapable of being alone. Why most people cannot handle being alone. Most people believe loneliness begins when there is nobody around them. But psychology reveals something far more disturbing. Loneliness often begins when a person loses the ability to tolerate their own mind. That is why someone can be surrounded by friends, relationships, conversations, and constant stimulation while still feeling emotionally unstable the moment silence appears. The modern world trained people to fear solitude without realizing it. Every second of the day is filled with distraction. Notifications invade attention. Social media creates endless comparison. Entertainment floods the mind from morning until night. Human beings are no longer taught how to sit quietly with themselves because silence no longer generates comfort. It generates anxiety. And this anxiety reveals something important. Many people are not escaping boredom. They are escaping internal confrontation. The moment external noise disappears, hidden emotions begin surfacing. Unresolved fears emerge. Insecurities become louder. Regrets start speaking. Thoughts people spent years suppressing suddenly appear in front of them without warning. This is why so many individuals compulsively seek stimulation. They are trying to avoid psychological exposure. Carl Jung warned about this dynamic throughout his studies on the unconscious mind. He believed that human beings spend enormous amounts of energy avoiding the parts of themselves they do not want to face. The ego builds distractions, social masks, routines, and emotional escapes to prevent direct contact with deeper truths hiding beneath the surface. But silence destroys those defenses. In solitude, there is no audience to impress, no social role to perform, no validation to chase. The personality constructed for society slowly begins collapsing, and many people become deeply uncomfortable when they realize they do not fully know who they are without external approval. This explains why some individuals cannot eat alone in public without feeling embarrassed, why others panic when nobody texts them back, why many feel emotionally empty after spending only a short period disconnected from social interaction. Their identity became dependent on external reinforcement because they never developed internal stability. The frightening part is that society often rewards this dependence. People are encouraged to constantly seek attention, exposure, approval, and recognition. Silence is treated like failure. Solitude is treated like rejection. Being alone is interpreted as weakness. But intelligent individuals slowly discover the opposite is true. A person incapable of being alone becomes emotionally vulnerable to almost everything. They become easier to manipulate through fear of exclusion, easier to pressure through social acceptance, easier to control through emotional dependency. When someone desperately needs constant validation, they unconsciously surrender their freedom to the opinions of others. That is why intelligent people eventually begin protecting their solitude, not because they hate people, but because they recognize the psychological damage caused by endless noise and superficial connection. They understand that constant stimulation weakens self-awareness. A distracted mind loses the ability to think deeply, and a person who never spends time alone rarely develops a strong relationship with themselves. Jung believed that self-knowledge requires confrontation with the inner world, and confrontation requires silence. This is why solitude becomes uncomfortable before it becomes powerful. At first, a person meets confusion, emotional tension, and hidden insecurity. But those who remain in silence long enough begin experiencing something rare in modern society: clarity. They start understanding their emotions instead of running from them. They stop reacting impulsively to every external opinion. They become less desperate for approval. Their thoughts become more independent. Slowly, the mind becomes stronger because it no longer depends entirely on outside stimulation to feel stable. And this is exactly where intelligent people begin separating themselves from the crowd. While most people spend their lives escaping themselves, a small number learn how to sit quietly inside their own minds without fear. Solitude as an invisible mental training. Most people see solitude as absence. Intelligent people eventually discover it as construction. While the average mind experiences silence as discomfort, deeper minds begin using it as psychological training. This is why some of the most mentally strong individuals in history spent long periods alone, not to escape the world, but to understand themselves beyond the noise of it. The modern world turned distraction into a lifestyle. People wake up consuming information before even understanding their own emotions. Their minds are constantly reacting instead of reflecting. But solitude interrupts this cycle. Silence forces the brain to slow down, and when the noise finally disappears, something unusual starts happening. The mind becomes visible to itself. At first, this experience feels uncomfortable. Thoughts become louder. Emotional confusion surfaces. Many people abandon solitude during this phase because they mistake discomfort for danger. But psychology shows something important here. The discomfort is not created by silence. Silence only exposes what was already hidden inside the person. Carl Jung believed that self-awareness could never develop through constant external stimulation. A person must withdraw from noise long enough to observe their own patterns, fears, emotional reactions, and unconscious behaviors. Without this process, people spend their entire lives acting automatically, controlled by impulses they barely understand. This is why solitude becomes a kind of invisible mental gym for intelligent individuals. In silence, the mind begins organizing itself. Emotions stop controlling every decision. Reactions become slower and more conscious. People start questioning their own beliefs instead of blindly absorbing the opinions around them. Little by little, mental clarity replaces emotional chaos. Most people never reach this stage because they are addicted to stimulation. They cannot tolerate the temporary discomfort required for psychological growth. They want peace without silence, clarity without reflection, confidence without self-confrontation. But real mental strength develops differently. A person who spends time alone thinking deeply begins noticing things others completely ignore. They recognize manipulation faster. They become less emotionally reactive. They stop needing constant approval to feel valuable. Solitude sharpens perception because the mind is no longer drowning in endless distraction. This is also why intelligent people often appear calmer than others. Their emotional stability was not built through constant social validation. It was built during silent moments nobody saw. While others were escaping themselves, they were studying themselves. And the deeper truth is even more powerful. The ability to remain alone without emotional collapse is one of the clearest signs of internal strength. Because when a person learns how to sit peacefully with their own thoughts, the world loses much of its power to psychologically control them. But there is a dangerous consequence waiting for people who never learn this lesson. A life without silence slowly creates a mind that can no longer hear itself clearly. The danger of a life without silence. A mind that never experiences silence slowly loses the ability to understand itself. This is one of the greatest psychological tragedies of modern life. People are constantly surrounded by information, opinions, entertainment, conversations, and stimulation, yet many have never spent enough time alone to discover who they truly are beneath all the noise. The problem is not distraction itself. The real danger is dependency on distraction. When a person becomes incapable of staying alone with their thoughts, external noise stops being entertainment and starts becoming emotional anesthesia. They consume content to avoid reflection. They stay busy to avoid feeling. They keep chasing stimulation because silence forces them to confront questions they are not prepared to answer. Who am I without approval? Why do I fear being ignored? Why does silence make me uncomfortable? Why do I need constant distraction to feel emotionally stable? Most people never stop long enough to ask themselves these questions. Carl Jung believed that unconscious behaviors dominate the lives of those who refuse self-examination. In other words, a person who never enters silence remains vulnerable to invisible psychological forces they barely understand. Fear, insecurity, ego, envy, emotional dependency, unresolved trauma, and social conditioning continue controlling decisions from the shadows. This is why a noisy life creates a weak inner world. When the mind is overloaded every second, deep thinking disappears. Reflection becomes rare. Emotional awareness weakens. People begin reacting automatically to everything around them. They absorb the emotions of society without questioning them. Anxiety spreads faster. Comparison becomes constant. Identity becomes unstable because it is built entirely on external influence. And modern society quietly encourages this condition. A distracted person is easier to manipulate, easier to pressure, easier to emotionally control. Someone who cannot tolerate solitude will often sacrifice authenticity just to avoid feeling alone. They stay in toxic relationships, fake friendships, exhausting environments, and empty conversations because silence feels more frightening than emotional exhaustion. But intelligent people eventually notice something dangerous about this cycle. The more noise surrounds the mind, the harder it becomes to hear personal truth. At some point, many people stop living according to their own conscience and start living according to social expectation. Their personality becomes performance. Their opinions become borrowed. Their desires become programmed by external influence. This is why solitude becomes psychologically necessary. Silence creates distance from collective confusion. It allows a person to observe life instead of constantly reacting to it. In solitude, intelligent individuals begin recovering something the modern world slowly destroys: independent thought. And once someone develops the ability to think clearly without the pressure of constant external influence, something powerful starts happening internally. Emotional dependency weakens, self-awareness grows, mental clarity increases. The person stops needing endless validation to feel valuable. But there is something even more unsettling about solitude that most people never expect. The longer someone stays in silence, the more impossible it becomes to tolerate superficiality. Why intelligent people distance themselves in silence. At a certain point in life, intelligent people begin changing in ways others rarely understand. They talk less, they observe more, they stop forcing connections. They become selective about where they spend energy, attention, and time. To the outside world, this distance sometimes looks cold, arrogant, or antisocial. But the truth is far deeper than that. Mentally mature people eventually realize that not every environment deserves access to their mind. Most conversations today are built on distraction, gossip, superficial validation, and emotional noise. People speak constantly, but rarely say anything meaningful. They react impulsively, seek attention compulsively, and avoid depth because depth requires self-awareness. Intelligent individuals begin noticing how exhausting this becomes over time. Carl Jung believed that people unconsciously adapt themselves to fit collective behavior. The longer someone stays immersed in chaotic environments, the more difficult it becomes to preserve individuality and psychological balance. This is why intelligent minds instinctively create distance from unnecessary noise. They understand that protecting mental clarity sometimes requires separation. And this separation is not hatred toward people. It is self-preservation. There is a massive difference between loneliness and intentional solitude. Loneliness comes from emotional emptiness. Solitude comes from psychological awareness. One weakens the mind, the other strengthens it. Intelligent people discover that constant exposure to superficiality slowly drains emotional energy and clouds clear thinking. This is why highly self-aware individuals often prefer silence over meaningless interaction. They would rather spend time reflecting, creating, learning, or observing than forcing themselves into environments that offer no psychological nourishment. The average person misunderstands this completely. Society treats constant social activity as proof of happiness and emotional health. But many people surrounded by endless company feel internally lost because they never developed a relationship with themselves. Meanwhile, someone sitting quietly alone may possess far more peace, stability, and emotional clarity than an entire room full of distracted people. Intelligent individuals begin recognizing something uncomfortable about human behavior. Many social interactions are built on performance rather than authenticity. People wear masks to gain approval. They hide insecurity behind confidence. They seek validation instead of truth. And after a while, deeper minds become exhausted by environments where nobody is truly honest about who they are. This is why solitude becomes attractive to intelligent people. Silence removes performance. In solitude, there is no pressure to impress anyone. The mind relaxes. Thoughts become cleaner. Emotions become easier to understand. The person reconnects with their own identity instead of constantly adapting to external expectations. And over time, something powerful begins happening psychologically. The need for approval weakens. A person who learns to enjoy their own company stops begging for emotional acceptance everywhere they go. They become less desperate for attention, less affected by rejection, and less willing to tolerate shallow relationships simply to avoid being alone. That is why calm, intelligent individuals often intimidate people without trying to. Their silence reveals emotional independence. And emotional independence is rare in a world where most people depend on constant external validation to feel valuable. But solitude does something even deeper than creating independence. Eventually, silence forces a person to confront the hidden parts of themselves most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Solitude creates a mind that cannot be easily controlled. One of the most dangerous things a person can develop in modern society is the ability to feel emotionally complete without constant external validation. The moment someone learns how to remain calm alone, think independently, and exist without desperate approval from others, they become psychologically difficult to manipulate. And this is exactly why solitude transforms intelligent people. Most emotional control systems in society operate through dependency. People are controlled through fear of rejection, fear of exclusion, fear of criticism, and fear of loneliness. Entire social structures rely on the human need to belong. That is why so many individuals silence their opinions, betray their values, and tolerate emotional disrespect simply to avoid feeling isolated. But solitude changes this dynamic completely. A person who has learned to be alone no longer fears silence the same way others do. They stop panicking when approval disappears. They stop collapsing emotionally when people misunderstand them. Their identity becomes less dependent on applause and more connected to internal conviction. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity begins when individuals stop living entirely through the expectations of others. But this process requires separation from collective influence. A person cannot clearly hear their own conscience while constantly drowning in external noise. This is why solitude strengthens independent thinking. When intelligent individuals spend time alone reflecting deeply, they begin noticing how much of society operates through unconscious conditioning. People repeat opinions they never examined. They pursue goals they never truly chose. They follow trends, beliefs, and behaviors simply because they fear standing apart from the crowd. But solitude weakens this unconscious obedience. In silence, a person starts questioning everything. What do I actually believe? What kind of life do I truly want? Which desires belong to me, and which were implanted by society? These questions create awareness, and awareness creates freedom. That is why emotionally independent people often appear calm under pressure. Their stability was not built on public approval. It was built in solitude, where they learned how to regulate emotions without needing constant reassurance from the outside world. And this creates a powerful psychological shift. The fear of rejection becomes weaker. The need to impress people decreases. The desperation for attention slowly disappears. A person who enjoys their own company becomes far less vulnerable to emotional manipulation because loneliness is no longer used as a weapon against them. This is something most people never achieve. Many individuals remain trapped in cycles of emotional dependence their entire lives. They need validation to feel worthy. They need attention to feel important. They need constant social interaction to avoid confronting internal emptiness. As a result, their decisions become controlled by external reaction instead of internal clarity. But intelligent people slowly escape this prison. The more comfortable they become in solitude, the less society can emotionally pressure them. They stop chasing acceptance everywhere they go. They stop performing for crowds. They stop sacrificing authenticity just to avoid standing alone. And ironically, this is often when they become most respected. Because there is something deeply powerful about a person who does not desperately need anything from the world emotionally. Their silence feels different. Their presence feels grounded. Their mind becomes difficult to influence. because it no longer depends entirely on external approval to remain stable. But solitude contains another side most people are not prepared for, because once the external noise disappears, something hidden inside the human mind slowly begins to emerge from the shadows. The encounter with the shadow, what most people cannot face. At first, solitude feels peaceful. The noise disappears. The pressure of the world becomes quieter. The mind slows down. But after enough silence, something unexpected begins happening. Hidden parts of the personality slowly start rising to the surface. This is the moment most people are not prepared for. Carl Jung called this hidden side of the human mind the shadow. The shadow contains everything a person tries to deny, suppress, hide, or avoid within themselves. Fear, envy, anger, insecurity, emotional wounds, desires they are ashamed of, pain they never healed, truths they spent years pretending did not exist, and solitude forces a confrontation with all of it. This is why many people abandon silence before transformation happens. They believe solitude will only bring peace, but before peace comes exposure. Silence removes distraction, and without distraction, the human mind can no longer hide from itself. A person may suddenly realize they built their entire identity around approval. Another may discover how deeply they fear rejection. Some confront loneliness they spent years covering with relationships, attention, and constant social activity. Others finally notice unresolved pain they buried beneath work, entertainment, or endless stimulation. The frightening part is that these things were always there. Solitude did not create them. Silence only revealed them. This is why intelligent people become psychologically different from the crowd. They do not run immediately when discomfort appears inside themselves. They stay long enough to observe it. They study their reactions. They question their fears. Instead of escaping internal darkness, they slowly begin understanding it. Jung believed this process was necessary for psychological growth. In his work, Ion researches into the phenomenology of the self. He explained that a person cannot become whole while rejecting the hidden parts of their own nature. The shadow must be confronted consciously. Otherwise, it controls behavior unconsciously for an entire lifetime. And this explains why so many people repeat destructive emotional patterns without understanding why. Unfaced insecurity becomes arrogance. Unfaced fear becomes control. Unfaced pain becomes emotional coldness. Unfaced loneliness becomes dependency. The shadow always finds a way to express itself when ignored. But solitude interrupts this unconscious cycle. For the first time, a person begins seeing themselves clearly without distraction, protecting the ego. This experience is uncomfortable because truth rarely feels pleasant in the beginning. The human mind naturally resists self-confrontation. It prefers illusion because illusion protects identity. Yet intelligent individuals eventually realize something powerful. The parts of yourself you confront consciously lose power over you. A person who faces insecurity becomes less controlled by validation. Someone who understands their fear becomes calmer under pressure. A person who accepts emotional wounds stops projecting pain onto others unconsciously. This is why solitude eventually creates emotional depth that superficial living can never produce. But there is another transformation waiting beyond the confrontation with the shadow. Once a person stops running from themselves completely, they begin discovering who they actually are beneath every social mask they were taught to wear. Solitude and the birth of true identity. Most people spend their entire lives becoming versions of themselves designed for survival, approval, and acceptance. From childhood, they learn what to say, how to behave, what emotions to hide, and which parts of their personality will be rewarded by society. Little by little, a mask is created. After enough years, many no longer know where the performance ends and the real self begins. This is why solitude becomes so psychologically powerful. In silence, the mask starts weakening. When there is nobody watching, nobody judging, and nobody expecting anything, a strange question begins appearing inside the mind. Who am I when I stop performing for the world? Carl Jung believed that one of the greatest tasks of human life was individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole by discovering the authentic self hidden beneath social conditioning. But this process cannot happen inside constant distraction. A person must spend time alone long enough to separate their true identity from the endless expectations imposed by society. And this separation changes everything internally. The individual begins noticing how much of their personality was built to gain approval, opinions they adopted only to fit in, behaviors created to avoid rejection, ambitions shaped by comparison instead of genuine purpose. Many people spend years chasing lives they never truly wanted because they never stopped long enough to ask themselves what actually belongs to them. Solitude creates that interruption. In silence, external voices become weaker. The pressure to imitate others slowly fades. For the first time, a person begins hearing their own thoughts clearly without society constantly speaking through them. This is why intelligent people often become more authentic over time, while others become more performative. Solitude forces self-observation, and self-observation exposes false identity. A person may realize they pretended to be strong while secretly terrified of vulnerability. Another may discover they built an entire personality around pleasing others. Some recognize they sacrificed authenticity for acceptance so many times that they lost connection with their real desires completely. These realizations are uncomfortable because truth destroys illusion, but they are also liberating. The moment someone stops needing to constantly perform, emotional freedom begins appearing. The mind becomes calmer because it is no longer exhausted trying to maintain endless social masks. There is no pressure to impress, no need to constantly prove worth. The individual starts existing more honestly. Jung warned that people who never confront their false identities eventually become strangers to themselves. They spend life adapting to every environment while never developing a stable inner core. Their personality changes depending on who surrounds them because it was built externally instead of internally. But solitude strengthens internal identity. The person begins making decisions based on conscience rather than approval. They stop automatically following collective behavior. They become less influenced by trends, pressure, and social expectation because their sense of self no longer depends entirely on external reaction. And this creates a powerful psychological presence. There is something unmistakable about a person who truly knows themselves. Their energy feels grounded. Their words carry weight. Their silence feels calm instead of insecure. They no longer desperately seek attention because they already found stability within themselves. But this transformation creates one final shift that few people fully understand. The deeper someone grows in solitude, the more powerful their presence becomes without needing to say much at all. The silent power of people who learn to be alone. There is a certain presence some people carry that cannot be explained through appearance, status, or words. They enter a room quietly, speak little, react calmly, and yet everyone feels their energy immediately. They do not compete for attention. They do not desperately try to impress anyone. And strangely, this makes them more powerful than those constantly demanding recognition. This is one of the hidden effects of solitude. People who spend enough time alone begin developing an inner stability that changes the way they move through the world. Their emotions become less chaotic. Their reactions become more controlled. They stop feeling the need to explain themselves to everyone because silence taught them something most people never learn. Real confidence does not need constant display. Carl Jung understood that individuals who confront themselves deeply become psychologically different from the crowd. They stop operating entirely from insecurity and social performance. The mind becomes more centered because it is no longer fragmented by endless external pressure. And this creates a powerful emotional calmness. Most people react impulsively because their minds are constantly overstimulated. Every opinion affects them. Every criticism shakes them. Every rejection feels personal. Their emotional state depends heavily on external circumstances. But solitude changes this pattern. A person who has learned to sit alone with discomfort develops emotional endurance. They become capable of observing feelings without immediately collapsing into them. Instead of reacting automatically, they pause. Instead of desperately seeking validation, they reflect. Their silence becomes intentional rather than fearful. This is why emotionally mature individuals often appear mysterious to others. The average person is used to loud insecurity disguised as confidence. Constant talking, constant self-promotion, constant emotional reaction. But someone shaped by solitude moves differently. Their calmness feels unusual because it is not performative. It comes from internal control, and this control becomes visible even without words. Their attention feels focused. Their energy feels grounded. They do not chase every distraction because they no longer fear silence. They do not desperately seek approval because their self-worth is no longer fully dependent on external reaction. This is why solitude often intimidates emotionally dependent people. Someone who needs constant validation struggles to understand a person who remains emotionally stable alone. A quiet mind becomes threatening in a world addicted to noise. Calmness exposes insecurity. Emotional independence exposes emotional dependence. And intelligent people understand this deeply. They realize that true power is not loud. True power is self-control. It is the ability to remain centered while others panic emotionally. It is the ability to think clearly while others react impulsively. It is the ability to walk alone without feeling psychologically incomplete. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations Book 4, paragraph 3, that people seek retreats in the countryside, by the sea, or in the mountains. But the greatest retreat exists within the mind itself. This is what solitude eventually teaches. Peace is not found by escaping the world. Peace is built by creating internal order strong enough to resist the chaos of the world. And once a person reaches this level of inner stability, something extraordinary happens. They stop fearing isolation. They stop fearing judgment. They stop fearing silence, because they finally understand that solitude was never emptiness. It was the place where their strongest self was quietly waiting to emerge. The ability the modern world is destroying. The modern world fears silence because silence awakens awareness. A person who constantly distracts themselves rarely questions anything deeply. They follow routines without reflection, absorb opinions without examination, and chase validation without understanding why. But the moment solitude enters someone's life seriously, something dangerous begins happening inside the mind. They start waking up psychologically. This is why modern society keeps people permanently stimulated. Endless notifications, constant entertainment, continuous noise. The system understands something most people do not realize. A distracted mind is easier to influence. A person who never stops to think deeply becomes vulnerable to emotional manipulation, social pressure, and unconscious conditioning. Carl Jung believed that human beings who avoid self-knowledge remain trapped inside patterns they cannot see. They become strangers to themselves while believing they are free. And this is exactly what happens to many people today. They spend years chasing approval, attention, success, relationships, and stimulation without ever asking the most important question of all: who am I beneath all this noise? Solitude forces that question into the open. And this is why so many people avoid it, because silence removes escape routes. In solitude, a person can no longer hide behind social performance. There are no distractions strong enough to permanently silence the inner voice asking difficult questions. What am I afraid of? Why do I need constant validation? Why do superficial distractions control my emotions so easily? What part of myself have I been running from my entire life? Most people spend decades avoiding these confrontations, but intelligent individuals slowly understand that solitude is not punishment, it is revelation. The silence they once feared becomes clarity. The loneliness they once resisted becomes strength. The isolation they once avoided becomes the place where emotional independence is finally built. And over time, something extraordinary happens psychologically. The individual stops depending entirely on the external world to feel complete. This is the hidden super ability solitude creates. A calm mind in a chaotic world. A clear identity in a society full of performance. An emotionally stable person surrounded by emotional dependency. Someone who can stand alone without collapsing internally becomes extremely difficult to manipulate because fear loses much of its control over them. That is why solitude changes intelligent people so deeply. It teaches them to observe before reacting, to think before following, to remain calm while others panic emotionally, to value depth instead of noise, to build self-respect instead of begging for approval. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all is this: the people who fear being alone are often disconnected from themselves. But the people who learn to embrace solitude eventually discover they were never truly empty. They were simply surrounded by too much noise to hear their own mind clearly. In the end, solitude is not the absence of people. It is the moment a human being finally stops running from themselves.